The basement air hung heavy, thick with the smell of stale coffee and unfulfilled promises. James, hunched over his computer screen, ran a hand through his damp hair. James as James. He was a man living on the edge, fueled by caffeine and the relentless pursuit of success. His phone buzzed, a jarring intrusion in his self-imposed isolation.
"Dad," Lucy said, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had descended upon the room.
Father John hesitated, torn between his duty to his daughter and his need for solace.
"Go," Emily said, her voice weak but firm.
"I'll be back soon," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung open, offering Father John a momentary respite from the relentless downpour. He stepped inside, the scent of incense and beeswax candles washing over him. He made his way down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished stone floor. Reaching the altar, Father John knelt heavily on the prie-dieu, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the votive candles. As he prayed, a profound stillness descended upon him, and then he saw it. A vision, clear and sharp, as if projected onto the very fabric of his mind. The vision faded as quickly and unexpectedly as it had appeared, leaving Father John shaken to his core.
Down in the depths of the basement, oblivious to the storm raging both outside and within his own family, James sat hunched over his computer screen. "Yes, that's right," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "We're just putting the finishing touches on it now. It's going to be big, I'm telling you, huge."
The image brought a pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, to James's chest. He had been so focused on his work, on achieving his goals, that he had neglected the very people who mattered most to him. He had convinced himself that he was doing it for them, for their future, for their security, but deep down he knew the truth.
The phone call ended, and a rare smile spread across James's face.
He leaned back in his chair, letting out a sigh of relief. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. He thought of Emily, her frail hand clutching his own during his last visit.
Grandpa went to the church again.
Her voice trailed off, her words catching in her throat.
"He blames himself, you know."
"No, that's not true. He's the strongest man I know."
The church was dark, lit only by the flickering flames of the votive candles that lined the altar. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and beeswax, a comforting familiarity that enveloped Father John like a warm embrace. He knelt before the altar, his head bowed, his hands clasped in prayer.
He had come seeking solace, seeking guidance in the face of a storm he felt powerless to control. Emily's deteriorating health, Lucy's quiet bravery, James's absence. These worries swirled within him, a tempest that threatened to consume him. He had always been a man of faith, his belief in God unwavering. But now, doubt crept in like a thief in the night, whispering insidious questions in his ear. Where was God in all of this? Why had he forsaken his daughter, his family?
A wave of exhaustion washed over him. He felt drained, his body heavy, his spirit weary. He longed for a sign, a whisper of reassurance, anything to ease the burden of fear that pressed down on him. The sound of the heavy wooden door creaking open startled him. He looked up, his heart leaping into his throat. For a moment he thought it was James. His son finally returned. But it was not James standing in the doorway. It was Lucy, her young face etched with a maturity beyond her years.
"Grandpa, I hope I'm strong enough for this."
Lucy stood at the back of the church, her silhouette framed against the backdrop of the storm-tossed sky visible through the open door. Rain, relentless in its assault, painted streaks on the ancient stone facade of the church. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the heavy oak door, a silent plea for strength in the face of her grandfather's despair. Inside, Father John remained oblivious to her presence, lost in the labyrinth of his own grief. His shoulders, usually straight with quiet strength, slumped under the weight of his worry. His hands, gnarled with age and hard work, clutched the worn beads of his rosary, seeking solace in their familiar touch. Lucy took a deep breath, steeling herself for the task ahead. She had always been her grandfather's ray of sunshine, her youthful energy a balm to his quiet seriousness. But now she was needed in a different role, a role that demanded a strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Pushing open the door, she stepped inside, the scent of incense and beeswax a familiar comfort in the storm of emotions that threatened to engulf her. The heavy door closed behind her with a resounding thud, the sound echoing through the vast emptiness of the church like a finality. Lucy said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. The sound of his name, spoken with such tenderness, seemed to break through the fog of despair that had settled over Father John. He turned slowly, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Lucy standing before him. A flicker of something akin to hope, fragile as a newborn butterfly, fluttered in his gaze. S4. Grandpa? Father John didn't stir. His eyes remained closed, his brow furrowed in concentration as his lips moved silently, forming words of prayer only he could hear. Lucy watched him, her heart aching at the sight of his distress. He seemed smaller somehow, his usual strength diminished by the relentless onslaught of worry. She walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished stone floor. Each step was an act of courage, a testament to the love that bound her to this man, her grandfather, her rock in a world that seemed determined to crumble around them. Reaching the altar, she stood behind him, her presence a silent offering of support. The stained glass windows, usually vibrant with color, seemed muted in the dim light of the stormy afternoon, casting long dancing shadows across the floor. The air hung heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and whispered prayers.
Lucy, what are you doing here? You should be at home with your mother.
His voice was hoarse with emotion.
Mom's resting. I thought you might need some company.
Lucy said, forcing a smile to her lips. She knelt beside him, her small hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. The gesture, so simple, so full of love, brought a lump to Father John's throat.
Yes, Lucy, it's bad.
And in that moment of shared vulnerability, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He was not alone. The city, a labyrinth of steel and glass, throbbed with a frenetic energy that mirrored the turmoil in James's heart. He stood at the window of his office, a panorama of New York City spread out before him like a glittering tapestry. He had conquered this city, his project a resounding success, yet a hollowness lingered, a sense of incompleteness that no amount of professional triumph could fill. James, I told you we could do it. Mark's voice boomed through the phone, his excitement palpable. James forced a chuckle, the sound hollow even to his own ears. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on his desk, a picture of his family. Back in the quiet stillness of her bedroom, Emily lay bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air fragrant with the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. She had overheard Lucy's hushed conversation with Father John earlier, the whispered words of worry and fear piercing her heart. But Emily knew the truth. She felt it in the slow, inexorable decline of her body. But she refused to surrender to despair. She had always been a fighter, facing life's challenges with quiet strength, and she would not let this illness rob her of her dignity, her spirit, her love for her family.
The traffic was a snarled mess, a symphony of honking horns and frustrated shouts. I drummed my fingers impatiently against the steering wheel, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I had tried calling my father again, but the call went straight to voicemail. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. I hated this feeling of helplessness. I was used to being in charge. My project paled in comparison to my family's well-being. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was my father. "Dad, is everything okay, James?" he said. "Emily, she's asking for you." The world outside seemed to fade, the cacophony of the city replaced by the quiet urgency in my father's voice. "I'm on my way," I said, my own voice firm despite the tremor of fear that ran through me. I hung up the phone, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Pulling over to the curb, I took a deep breath, willing myself to remain calm. I had faced countless deadlines, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles in my career. But this was different. This was about family, about love, about the fragility of life itself. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lucy. "Mom's getting worse," it read, the words stark in their simplicity, their message unmistakable. "Please hurry." I closed my eyes, the image of my mother's frail hand clutching my own during my last visit flashing before my eyes. I had been so focused on my own ambitions, my own pursuit of success, that I had allowed myself to drift away from the people who mattered most. I had told myself it was for them, for their future, for their security. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been running from my fears, my responsibilities, my own vulnerability.
The sports field buzzed with a nervous energy. Parents huddled together, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension as they watched their children compete. On the field, young athletes stretched and paced, their bodies taut with nervous energy, their eyes focused on the finish line. I stood poised at the starting line, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the muffled roar of the crowd, feel the weight of expectation on my shoulders. But in that moment, all that mattered was the race ahead, the chance to prove myself, to make my family proud. The starting gun fired, a sharp crack that echoed through the stadium. I surged forward, my legs pumping, my lungs burning with exertion. I could see my competitors out of the corner of my eye, their bodies straining, their faces contorted with effort. But I refused to yield. I thought of my mother, her quiet strength in the face of adversity. I thought of my grandfather, his unwavering faith even in the darkest of times. And I thought of my brother, his ambition a double-edged sword that had both driven him and isolated him.
The hospital room was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of the machines that monitored my mother's vital signs. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air fragrant with the scent of fresh rain and new beginnings. I sat beside my mother's bed, my hand resting lightly on hers. The doctor's words echoed in my ears. "She's weak, James. We're doing everything we can, but..." I was here, finally with my family, my presence a silent apology for my absence,